What's up, guys? Welcome back. We got the American Civil War, Oversimplified, Part 2. We've done Part 1 already. Make sure that is up for you guys to see on the screen right now. If you haven't seen Part 1, you can go back and watch that first and then come to this one after. But without further ado, let's get to Part 2.
Yes.
As the Union struggle to take control in the East continued, elsewhere, the war raged on. The Confederates attempted an invasion of Kentucky, hoping the state as a whole would join them, but they were pushed back. The Indian Territory saw Native American tribes ally with one side or the other in the hopes of securing rights after the war. Along the Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant remained one of the few Union generals scoring major victories. With his best pal, General Sherman, by his side, Grant led his armies down the Mississippi to the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg. Both sides knew that if Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy would be split in two, and the Confederates prepared for an intense defense of the city. But back in the East, Lincoln still wanted somebody to march south and take Richmond. Having given General McClellan the boot, he needed a new man in charge. All right, Mr. President, option 1 is General Hooker. Bit of a nutcase, but a good general. Option 2, his qualifications are his name is Burnside and he has freaking dope-ass sideburns. Say no more. So General Burnside was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac and sent south. Lincoln hoped he finally had a general who could succeed. Burnside met General Lee at the city of Fredericksburg, where he intended to rapidly cross the river and take the city. But the Union War Department was too slow in delivering the pontoon bridges, and the two sides were forced to camp across from each other, close enough to speak. Hey Yankee, ready to get your butt kicked? Yeah, right, rebel. God is on our side. No way, God's on our side. Oh, you think so? Well, why don't we ask him? Hey God, whose side are you on? Ow. Dude, uncool. With over 100,000 men, the Union Army finally launched their massive attack on the 11th of December. But by now, the Confederates had amassed their forces. During the battle, wave after wave of brave Union men marched headlong into a brutal Confederate onslaught. Even the Confederates couldn't believe what they were seeing, and in one moment of camaraderie, a Confederate sergeant, unable to take it, reportedly came out into the field to tend to the Union wounded. Seeing this, the Union troops held their fire. Still, Burnside and his forces were soundly defeated at Fredericksburg and forced to retreat. Lincoln's popularity and Northern morale continued to plummet, especially as the winter heading into 1863 was bad. The winter camps were rife with disease. The food was less than appealing. On both sides, men began to leave. Hey, where do you think you're going? I'm deserting. What? Don't you love your country? Yes, I do. And I'm trying to get back to it as quick as I can. Lincoln, ever the kind and caring man he was, spent much of his time pardoning deserters' death sentences. Oh my, here's a 17-year-old boy sentenced to be hanged. Well, I'd better suspend his sentence, or he'll be suspended tomorrow. What? To try to keep the numbers up, both sides had introduced conscription. There was controversy in the North, however, since rich men could simply pay to have someone else fight on their behalf. Riots broke out in New York City, with enraged mobs furious at the idea of going to fight for slaves. An idea that
rich men could have people fight on their behalf. Some things don't change.
Yes, seriously.
Those guys calling all the shots in Washington now don't think they're the ones going over there to do the dirty work.
Never have, never will be.
Exactly.
many of them simply did not support. However, after so much pressure, the Union had finally begun allowing black men to enlist, and these men, knowing what they were fighting for, signed up. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 troops, 10% of the Union Army, would be black. The valor and bravery they showed throughout, silencing critics. Okay, well that last guy was useless. Let's try this Hooker fella. General Joseph Hooker was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and once again, Lincoln ordered him to move south and take Richmond. Hooker met Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville, where Hooker had over twice the men Lee did. Lee was forced to defy all military convention and split his smaller force into two. Lee had absolutely no chance of winning, and Lee won. It was his masterpiece. Lee did suffer one significant loss during the battle, though. As his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, was riding back to the Confederate lines at night, the nervous Confederate troops, unable to recognize him, opened fire.
Are you kidding me?
You boys done goofed up. Jackson died 8 days later. As for Lincoln, he couldn't believe it. It was yet another...
How crazy is that? Like, you go through so many battles and you win so much, and then your own troops kill you?
Because they're nervous and don't know what's going on.
Like, this guy's literally riding back from battle, been in battle, won, and you guys get nervous and kill him. Maybe there's more to the story in that. You guys can
Yeah.
elaborate on what actually happened.
Oversimplified.
Oversimplified it, but that would be probably the worst way to go.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Their loss and Northern support continued to waver. While the Union kept on struggling in the East, out west, unconditional surrender Grant was making moves as always. In an attempt to take Vicksburg on the Mississippi, he made a series of risky and bold movements. He sent a cavalry raid and feigned Sherman north to confuse the enemy. Then, aided by a fleet of ironclads on the river, he raced his army south to cross the Mississippi. Aware that the terrain to the north was restrictive, instead, he strategically moved northeast, hitting Vicksburg's supply line and defending his rear from Confederate armies in Jackson. Once he reached Vicksburg, the Confederate defense became hardened, and Grant was forced to settle in for a month-long siege, during which time he got rather bored. Despite not taking the city, Lincoln loved it and encouraged Grant to hold firm. It would only be a matter of time before the Mississippi was in Union hands. Around this time, the people in the west of Virginia, who had remained loyal to the Union throughout, finally broke away to form their own state. They could have named it anything in the world, but the creative minds at the time came up with the ingenious West Virginia. Back in Washington, Lincoln once again wanted a new general to take command. Oh my goodness, why do all these 19th century generals look so bust? Look, we got Sleepy Eyes Joe here. That's Princess Leia with a mustache. E.T. phoned the doctor. Fine, why don't we give Snapping Turtle McGee here a shot? So General Snapping Turtle McGee was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and it was a crucial time for the Union, because once again, the Confederates decided to go on the attack. So far, they had done exceedingly well militarily, but as the war kept going, the Confederate economy was crumbling. Riots broke out in the streets of Richmond as the price of bread skyrocketed. Supplies were dwindling. Jefferson Davis wanted to send men west to rescue Vicksburg, but General Lee knew the longer the war lasted, the worse their chances got. And he still hoped if he could just threaten D.C., the already demoralized North would surrender. So in June 1863, with the momentum behind him, General Lee once again entered the North, fighting his way through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. General Meade set out to meet him for what would be the most significant battle of the entire war. If the Confederates won, D.C. could fall. If the Union won, it would be a turning point, as the Confederates would run out of steam, and the small town that was to get caught up in the crossfire of the largest battle in American history was Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On June 1st, units from each army encountered one another and skirmished through the town itself. The townspeople were forced to take refuge, except for one man who reportedly ran outside for a strange reason. "Joseph, what are you doing?" "I'm not gonna let them take my beans." "How many times do I have to tell you they're not here for your beans?" By the second day, over 100,000 men stretched for miles across the battlefield. Lee took the initiative, deciding to hit the enemy's flanks, and he came very close to breaking through the Union's disorganized left. But Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge, smashing into the Confederates and forcing them back. The Union forces held across the line. On the final day, Lee believed the Union Army had fortified its flanks, so he decided to finish them off with one massive central assault. The Confederates rushed at the Union lines during General Pickett's charge, and this time, it was the Union's turn to unleash hell. Meade had correctly guessed Lee's strategy, and the Confederates were decimated, forced to turn and flee. A devastated General Lee called out to his fleeing and wounded men, telling them it was his fault. And after holding for a counterattack that never came, he ordered a retreat back into Virginia. The North had just managed to score a massive victory, and one they desperately needed. And if that wasn't enough, in the West, after a month-long siege, Vicksburg finally fell. The North now held the Mississippi. And better yet, it was...
It's so crazy just knowing that, like, one small loss within the larger battle, you know, between the flanks could make or break the whole outcome.
Yeah, it makes such a big difference.
Yeah. And then on top of that, it's just perplexing to me where they keep getting all these men from.
I know.
You know, because the population is obviously much less at the time.
Yeah.
And, you know, they've obviously enlisted probably a lot of what they can enlist to begin with, but, you know, they keep
dying.
Suffering these casualties and keep pulling people out of somewhere, but I don't know where they're coming from.
Yeah, well, I think they had said in there like that at one point they were trying to make people enlist, weren't they? And that's why the mothers were getting upset. Mm-hmm. And then the probably influx of at least from the North, the soldiers they got once they started allowing
for sure the
black people, like the black men, to join.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Vicksburg finally fell. The North now held the Mississippi. And better yet, it was the 4th of July. With control of the Mississippi, Union forces moved into Arkansas and Tennessee. Tennessee in particular saw heavy fighting, with Union General Rosecrans masterfully pushing Braxton Bragg's Army of the Tennessee out of Tennessee. He suffered a major setback, however, at the bloody Battle of Chickamauga and ended up under a Confederate siege at Chattanooga. At one point during the siege, a temporary truce was declared so that wounded men could be recovered. And often in the Civil War, during these small truces, men from both sides would meet in the middle to trade things like tobacco, coffee, and Vicksburg, 4th of July, and the Siege of Chattanooga. Thankfully, General Grant, now in charge of all Western Union armies, showed up and karate-kicked Bragg right back into Georgia. Like this. With Sherman and Hooker, Grant took on Confederate positions in the mountains around the city, including the famous battle above the clouds and Mission Ridge. Grant continued to be Lincoln's #1 guy. With these victories, Lincoln hoped the war was finally turning. Back in Gettysburg, the entire town had been turned into a hospital to care for the scores of wounded men. Throughout the war, on both sides, women such as Clara Barton rose to the occasion, doing crucial work on the home front and volunteering as nurses. For those who had given their lives, a new national cemetery was to be established at Gettysburg, and Abraham Lincoln traveled out to attend the opening ceremony. At the event, the main speaker spoke for 2 hours. Then, Abraham Lincoln was called forward to give some brief, appropriate remarks. In just 2 minutes, he masterfully and poignantly iterated America's national purpose and the need to continue the fight. The Gettysburg Address would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. While they were now making progress, the North still couldn't find a decisive victory in the East, and that was...
It's interesting because I've heard the Gettysburg Address mentioned many times, but I never knew how it came to be.
Yeah, or like what it was from or whatever.
Yeah, and now I know how it came about. So that was informative.
Some context.
This is bad news for Lincoln because his presidency was now in its 4th year. In 1864, there was an election coming. The Confederates knew this too, and with little hope left of being able to threaten the North militarily, they believed their last shot at victory may be in the election, since Lincoln, emancipation, and the war itself weren't exactly popular. People in the North were sick of war and wanted to put it behind them. Robert E. Lee hoped that if he could just hold out and continue to inflict more defeats, the people of the North would vote Lincoln out and replace him with a Southern sympathizer who may be willing to negotiate. Lincoln knew now he desperately needed a victory. Now, I know what you're thinking, but oversimplified. If Lincoln loves General Grant so much, then why doesn't he put him in charge of the campaign in the East? Well, guess what, loyal subscriber? You've hit the nail on the head. You're bold, Grant. I'll grant you that. I'm promoting you to General-in-Chief, and I ain't taking you for granted. Now I want you to go defeat Lee. Grant me my wish. Please stop. So Grant was put in charge, and he came up with a new plan. He wanted to press the Confederates on all fronts, with General Banks to capture Mobile, Alabama, General Sherman moving south to Atlanta, and Grant joining the Army of the Potomac as they advanced through Virginia. In May 1864, that plan went into action. Sherman steadily advanced on Atlanta, facing off against a smaller Confederate army under General Joseph E. Johnston. In addition, a cruel yet highly skilled cavalry general and winner of the funniest Confederate statue award, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was also nearby, doing his best to threaten Sherman's advance. But in a series of battles, Sherman dominated and pushed Johnson back to the city. But he was held just outside of Atlanta itself and was forced to lay siege. Meanwhile, the main show was happening to the east in Virginia. The Union's top general was finally about to face off against the Confederacies. Lincoln hoped Grant would bring something new to the Eastern Theater, and bring something new he did. As Grant began moving south, Lee still regularly outmaneuvered him and inflicted heavy casualties, hoping to demoralize the North as much as he could. But here's what set Grant apart from others. He knew Lee was running out of men, and that the North by comparison had plenty. Grant would throw his forces at Lee, and even when Lee repelled them, Grant, rather than pulling back, would give the order to keep moving forward and flank Lee, again and again. In under 6 weeks, 80,000 men would be killed, wounded, or missing.
That's
in
crazy.
D.C., Grant was criticized for being a
6
butcher.
weeks.
At the Battle of the Wilderness, the Union casualties were so heavy that Grant reportedly began to weep. But still, Grant could replace his losses. Lee couldn't, and he was being pushed all the way back to Richmond. Lee knew once he got there, he'd be under siege. Then, it would only be a matter of time. Close to Richmond, Grant again suffered horrific casualties in a miscalculated assault at Cold Harbor. Then, trying to be a trickster, instead of moving on Richmond directly, Grant moved towards Petersburg to flank the Confederate capital and cut its supply line. But, just like Sherman, Grant was halted outside of the city and he too was forced to settle in for a siege. 2 identical sieges would not be good enough for Lincoln's re-election. The people of the North saw the casualties Grant had been taking, and they weren't happy. To make matters worse, Lee had sent Jubal Early north to threaten D.C. with the hope of forcing Grant to withdraw troops from Richmond. Early was repelled on the outskirts of the city, with President Lincoln even attending as an observer, but the North had been given a fright. So with the war currently in a stalemate, who was to be Lincoln's opponent in the critical 1864 election? Who would the Democrats choose? Guess what, baby? I'm back. That's right. General George B. McClellan would run for president against Abraham Lincoln. My fellow countrymen, if you elect me, I, the great General George McClellan, will fearlessly and valiantly win the war.
So that's interesting because in our first video that we did, we had a little bit of a discussion about why Abraham Lincoln was having so much trouble getting his general to pursue the goals that he wanted to achieve. And I had made mention in that video that it probably was due to the fact that they weren't totally on board with the ideology of
and now here he's going to go against him.
Now he's running for the opposite party, which obviously supports the Confederates, and it's a completely different ideology. So that's really interesting. Also, just make quick mention, it just blows my mind that 80,000 people died in 6 weeks. Because
that's sickening.
This is 1860s we're talking about. So the warfare that they're using, like we're not talking about any of the machine guns that they got going on today, bombs, grenades, heavy artillery in any
literally
kind
just
of sense.
Shotguns.
Well, yeah, rifles and stuff that they're using, right? And so to have 60,000 people die or 80,000 in 6 weeks, like it's just mind blowing to me that happened. And then you're seeing also the repercussions, in some sense, of not having any of those advanced weaponized tools in the extension of this war, that they're just got to bring in more and more men, and they just try to draw it out longer and longer and allow these numbers to dwindle and dwindle and dwindle. And unfortunately, more and more people are dying, right? It's just like I said, one of the things that maybe we don't compute right away is knowing that this is so long ago, how the warfare would have been so different.
100%, which is crazy because you don't even think about that like logically off the top of your head. Like so many people.
Unlike this douchebag, many Democrats, however, including McClellan's running mate, wanted to end the war. So it's possible McClellan may have ended up fearlessly and valiantly making peace with the Confederates, which is exactly what they were hoping for. With the war in a stalemate and Lincoln still not popular, it looked like McClellan would win, and the Confederacy may have a chance at surviving after all. Lincoln himself said that without some kind of major victory, it seemed exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Well, fret not, Abe, because if it's a major victory you want, it's a major victory you'll get. Atlanta had been under siege by General Sherman for just over a month. After a number of battles around the city, Sherman sent a force south to sever the city's supply line, and Confederate General Hood was forced to abandon it. Atlanta, one of the Confederacy's most important cities, had fallen into Union hands. For many, it was clear that the Confederacy's defeat was now inevitable, and the war would soon be over. When the final results came in, Lincoln had won with an electoral college landslide, with the troops in particular voting overwhelmingly for Lincoln, which must have been touching for their commander-in-chief. Hey man, looks like you lost. No hard feelings? I didn't lose. I merely failed to win. In January, Lincoln involved himself heavily in ensuring the 13th Amendment made it through Congress. In a narrow and historic vote, the amendment passed. Slavery would now be constitutionally banished throughout the nation. Black men and women, watching the vote from the galleries, knew the work had only just begun. A couple months later, at his second inauguration, with victory right around the corner, he didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat. Instead, he emphasized the need for reunification and binding up wounds. To him, Americans, North or South, were to again be compatriots. However, listening to Lincoln speak that day was a man who had no interest in reunification, John Wilkes Booth. An actor living in D.C. was also a deep Southern sympathizer, and as the war turned against the Confederacy, depressed and full of hate, he was already plotting his revenge on the man he held responsible. With further Confederate losses, it was pretty clear at this point who would win. But still, Jefferson Davis showed no sign of giving in. The North were frustrated to see the conflict being dragged out. why waste more lives? In Atlanta, General Sherman believed he had the key to forcing the Confederacy's hand. He had an unusually modern concept that an army could only survive with the support of the people. Strike at the people, and the army collapses. Sherman decided to do something unprecedented. He would remove his 62,000 men from their supply line and march through the heartland of the Confederacy, where they would live off the land. There, they would wreak havoc. As they marched, they tore up railroads, burned farms, and destroyed communication lines. They also liberated thousands of slaves. The damage done was estimated at $1.4 billion. The tactics were cruel, but to Sherman, it was better than losing yet more men in battle. In December, he reached Savannah, Georgia, but he wasn't done yet. Next, he turned north to inflict his punishment on the first state to secede, South Carolina. As he moved, he came ever closer to General Lee's army, still holding out at Petersburg. The siege of Petersburg had lasted for 292 days. 60,000 of Lee's men had deserted. Numerous Union attempts to break through had failed, but when the breakthrough finally came, it came quick. On April 2nd, a Union assault finally pushed the Confederates from their defenses. Hey man, there's no need to evacuate, right? You'll rescue us like last time, right? Sorry, can't hear you. Lee narrowly escaped the city, hoping he'd be able to meet up with General Johnson and continue the fight. Grant chased him down. Richmond was evacuated, and Jefferson Davis went on the run. As they left, the Confederates set fire to military buildings, but the flames burnt out of control, and as the Union troops arrived, they became firefighters. A couple of days later, Abraham Lincoln visited the war-torn city. Grant caught up to Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, where he trapped his forces. It was here, on April 9th, 1865, that Lee saw no point in continuing. Sir? Listen, bub. I drank a bit too much last night, and now I'm hanging like a fruit bat on a hot day. So whatever you have to say, I don't want to hear it. General Lee says he wants to surrender. Hot diggity dog! Grant and Lee met in the home of a nearby farm family, owned by a man who had tried his best to escape the Civil War years earlier, Wilmer McLean. All right, can we all just hurry up and get this over with? Martha! Not now! I'm cleaning! Do you want us to get rats? Grant and Lee, after years of war, now spoke respectfully to one another. When Lee left, his face filled with emotion, Grant's men began to cheer, but Grant ordered them to stop. He knew that now was the time for reconciliation. Just over 2 weeks later, General Johnson would surrender to Sherman, ending the war for 89,000 Confederate soldiers in the largest surrender of the war. Not every Confederate state had surrendered, but the war was as good as over. Across the North, church bells rang out and celebrations erupted. In Washington, Lincoln gave a speech from the White House to a jubilant crowd, in which, among various things, he expressed his support for black voting rights. Lincoln had seen the nation through its deepest crisis. The presidency had visibly aged him. He had lost over 20 pounds. He said sometimes, "I think I am the tiredest man on earth." I'm not sure tiredest is a word, but geez, the man's exhausted. Cut him some slack. On a carriage ride with Mary, Lincoln clearly was looking forward to being a president in a time of peace. He was apparently very cheerful, surprising his wife, and he told her that between the war and the loss of their son, they'd both been very miserable. Now, it was time to be happy. On the evening of April 14th, Lincoln attended a play with his wife and some friends at Ford's Theater. It was a comedy, and the president appeared to be enjoying it very much. In a nearby bar, John Wilkes Booth swallowed 2 glasses of brandy. He slipped quietly into the president's booth and awaited for the audience's laughter to rise. The president was shot in the back of the head. Booth fled the city. Soldiers carried Lincoln to a boarding house across the street. There, doctors declared there was nothing they could do. Surrounded by his heartbroken wife, son, and members of cabinet, at 7:22 the next morning, President Lincoln passed away. Never before had a president been murdered. A shocked nation mourned as a 12-day funeral procession carried Lincoln back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. On April 26th...
So did you know that?
No.
I knew he had been assassinated. I didn't know really in the manner at which it happened.
That's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, for so many reasons. Clearly, you know, they're discussing him being the first president to be assassinated. It was probably, you know, something that shook the nation as a whole. But to know, like, it's at the back end of all of this fighting and all this work that he had done, and, you know, unfortunately, I now understand, I guess, why he was looked at as such a highly regarded individual in U.S. history.
And
I knew
persevered through so much.
And I knew he played a role in the abolishment of slavery, but I didn't know how this had taken place. So
Yeah,
this has been super eye-opening for me. But coming back to Abraham Lincoln and the person, right, because we look at him as a figure, and it's just so terrible to know, like, you know, all that he went through, and he's coming to the, you know, the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak.
Yeah.
And somebody comes in and you know, takes that all away. And, you know, it's because he stuck his neck out for other people and tried to make a difference. Of course, there's probably political influence and all this other, you know, all these other dynamics that played a role in why he made the decisions he made. But at the end of the day, without Abraham Lincoln, who knows what today's world would look like.
Could have looked so different.
And so, you know, that the fact that, like I said, you know, he was a white guy that stuck his neck out to do the right thing, which as we know, was the right thing to do. But then have, you know, one of his own people, quote unquote, come and just, in so many respects, whether it's, you know, culture or country alignment, you know, where he's from, where he lives, his own countrymen, kill him. And, you know, for a difference that he was trying to make in a positive change at the end of working so hard. It's just such a terrible story.
Yeah,
the way it
awful.
ends, you know?
And it's so crazy because, like, obviously this is a very long time ago, but in today's day and age, like, nobody would even have the opportunity to just, like, walk up behind you and do that, right? Like, they would never let anybody get that close to a president these days, right? Mm-hmm. So in that time, right, this guy just, like, walks into your booth and, like, bop, you're dead.
Yeah.
That's just mind-blowing to me that even happened.
Well, yeah, especially after all that's already happened with war being at play, right? And, you know, at the end of it, he's, like I said, just caught off guard probably because he's in a celebratory mood, thinking that we're all coming together. Out with his wife. And enjoying the peace now that's taking place. And, you know, somebody changes the course of history in the snap of the fingers, right?
Before had a president been murdered, a shocked nation mourned as a 12-day funeral procession carried Lincoln back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. On April 26th, Union cavalry found John Wilkes Booth in a barn in Virginia, where he was shot. Not long after, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was also tracked down and arrested. Imprisoned for 2 years, he was eventually released. The North didn't want to put him on trial for fear the jury may rule that Southern secession had in fact been legal. To ensure reconciliation, other Confederate generals and politicians were allowed to re-enter life in the now restored Union. Scattered fighting continued into May, when the last Confederate forces in Texas disintegrated. The Southern states came under Northern military occupation to prevent any further rebellion, and a very difficult era of Reconstruction began. Over 3 million Americans had fought, brother against brother. The Civil War remains the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history. But the Union had been preserved. You could say the real winners were those who were to never again be slaves. Further amendments passed by Congress gave black individuals the right to citizenship and to vote. Significant progress had been made. However, entering into the 20th century, it was clear the fight for equality would continue. In modern America, the man who fought to preserve the nation and never gave up in the darkest of times stands as a symbol of honesty, empathy, humility, perseverance, and courage. A continuous reminder of what has forged America and what it should ever strive to be.
I think that was a good way to close, you know, highlighting him as a leader.
Yeah.
Right? And I think his nickname was Honest Abe. If I remember, the people used to call him that.
Yeah, he was like stuck for like what was right and doing the right thing, and
how times have changed today from our political leaders. We'll say, we won't get into that, but just so mind blowing that, you know, he was clearly a person that led by example. In so many respects, and that is not evident today. But
it's also crazy that he was like that. And then there's obviously parts in here where like the people didn't like him and he didn't think he was going to get reelected and stuff like that, even though he was just trying to do the right thing.
Well, that's what I was saying about him sticking his neck out on the line. Like, he put himself in the line of fire, and then he ended up getting killed for it because he was trying to do what was right. And it's just crazy that there will be so much pushback at times for the thing that's clearly the right thing to do from people that don't want their way of life changed, right?
Yeah.
Because it's going to, as we said in our part 1, there's a personal individual benefit that's lost, and that's what people are fighting against, right? It's also wild to me that they allowed, the leaders in the South from the Confederates to just re-engage back into society so seamlessly, essentially, for
like
2 years.
No punishment, really. Well, I guess 2 years being in prison, but still.
But that's ridiculous, I mean, in my opinion, because like you literally almost tore the entire country apart, right? Everybody basically agrees that what you were doing was wrong. So you went against the Constitution of the United States, and you only got 2 years for it.
Yeah.
I mean, not to like go into another tangent, but look what they're trying to do to Donald Trump today. I mean, I don't necessarily, fall on any side of the political spectrum in that regard, and I'm not going to debate what he did was right or wrong. I'm just saying, comparatively, this guy gets 2 years and tried to tear apart the entire country of in a war that ended up having the most deaths in American history.
Yep.
And and that was, anyways. The one thing I will say is like I'm, unanimously against war in all respects, basically, other than in something like this instance where they were fighting for people's rights and freedoms to be as they should. And so unfortunately, a lot of people lost their lives in that, right, which is terrible. But they were fighting for an actual good cause, that needed to happen.
Standing up for people and what was right.
So there's been so many worse reasons to go to war in the past, right?
Yeah, agreed.
And
it's also different too when it's internal conflict, right? Like, of course, obviously, there's external conflict that sometimes your country needs defending or whatever, but internally, like, you're trying to set the tone for what should be taking place as a president in your own country.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a little bit different.
Yeah. And I also, it's really makes my mind start to turn in that how you would feel being a certain person in that time period. So, if you were an African American, obviously you would have been, all for getting freedom, and whether you were in the North or the South, how you would have felt in those positions. Then if you were, an American that wasn't an African American, how you would have felt, because there are people that felt one way, as we just discussed with the Confederates, versus in the northern side of things. But then the war that proceeded from that, right? So, it's like, if you're an African American, it's like brutal because your fate is left up to people that aren't you.
Well, especially too for the time period where they weren't even letting the African Americans go fight. It's like you feel so helpless because they're fighting for your cause, but you can't even
do
contribute.
Anything about it. Right.
Yeah.
Whether you wanted to or not, right? Yeah. And like I said, your future is being left up to other people deciding it, which is just scary and mind-blowing. But then even beyond the other side of the coin is you have white people who have no vested interest in it, right? And they're risking their lives and losing their lives and their families and their sons and whatever.
Or feeling like they have to go
right, fighting for a cause that has no benefit to themselves.
Yeah.
And we talked about the individual benefit throughout, right? So it's pretty wild, all the dominoes that took place throughout this, American Civil War and, where we are today in light of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy because, obviously we've come a long way since then, but in some ways I feel like there's a lot of internal conflict in the U.S. right now. So,
yeah, I think that goes far beyond what obviously we saw in this. It's more of, I think, it's similar in ideologies and perceptions of how the world should work, and those will always be present.
Yeah.
But they change as time goes, and you're always going to have this, I feel like this left-right pull push based on the time period and where the world is and where we're going to end up.
Yeah.
So anyways,
Yeah.
that's enough for today, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed our part 2. If you did, hit
Yeah.
the like button for us, leave us a comment, and make sure you leave us any suggestions down below. I think
Continue to learn more on our historical journey.
yeah, I think history of the entire world, I guess, is one of the ones that you guys have recommended. So maybe we'll get into that one next.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's it from us today, guys. We'll be back tomorrow with 2 more videos.
Thanks for watching, guys. See you that.